My name's Chris Hatherley. I'm the CEO of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia, and delighted to be hosting this webinar this morning, one of a series of 9 webinars we are staging with conveners Roy McLeod and Claire McFarlane on the social sciences and space. Before we start, I'm going to share an acknowledgement of country video that we have prepared for this purpose.
Wherever you are across Australia,
we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land.
The Darug peoples,
the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation,
the Gundungurra people of the Southern Highlands,
the Ngunnawal people of the Canberra region on whose country we are standing,
and all other peoples of this vast continent.
Their ongoing connection through custodianship of its land and waters,
physical and spiritual,
through culture, language and ceremony.
Where sovereignty was never ceded, we pay our respects to elders past, present and still to come.
Thank you. And I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people on whose lands I'm joining this meeting from today. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our series convener, Professor Roy McLeod. Roy has brought together this series of panel discussions, a fantastic lineup. And he's doing so as both a fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia and a fellow of the Academy of Humanities. Roy, over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome to everybody. Greetings from the my living room in Neutral Bay and from the Camarago people of North Sydney, where I live, to our series on Australia's future in space, an emerging agenda for the social sciences. My name, as Chris has mentioned, is Roy McLeod. I'm a historian of science and an emeritus professor of modern history at the University of Sydney. And a sometime Charles Lindbergh Professor of Aerospace History at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum. As one born in the Kennedy generation who has lived with space for most of his life, from Gemini to Apollo and beyond, I wanted to use this series in some way to share with you my own interest and passion in the adventure of space and my own concern for its future direction. Some may say that to launch such a series in the midst of the worst pandemic in a century, of course, is taking liberty, and it's perhaps not the best idea, but certainly in no way must we let our attention be distracted from these urgencies that are surrounding us. But it's just for a moment that I want to ask you to sit with me and let me take you to slip to these early bonds of Earth, to consider what might be awaiting us and may well be upon us even before the end of the present decade. Now, for many of us, the idea that we will be active agents in space is a given. And during the last 2 years, few will have missed the rapid series of space-related events taking place around the world. In 2019, remember, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the lunar landing. 2020, the International Space Station celebrated its 20th anniversary. This year, there have been no fewer than 11 significant space missions by my count. In March, we saw the success of SpaceX, and in June, news of NASA's commercial payload services. And we're soon to see, I believe, with any luck, the launch of the James Webb Space Telescope, which will, in some sense, overtake and replace Hubble, and open even more magnificent vistas for us to explore. But all of these, needless to say, are the work of brilliant science and technology on a grand scale. But we've also seen in the last few years, and last year in particular, the arrival of new forms of human endeavor, notably in the shape of space tourism, led by Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson, and soon I'm sure to be followed by Elon Musk, Well, underlining the fact that space has become a very human enterprise, replete with human stories of competition and controversy, as well as discovery. Many see in this a danger of first principles and idealistic possibilities being rushed by commercialization, even militarization, raising questions about the ethics and behavior that should condition and frame our presence in space. Meanwhile, the hard work of space diplomacy proceeds at pace, as we all know. Long have nations debated the need to strengthen the conditionalities of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. And recently, since last year, we've now seen 12 countries becoming signatories to the Artemis Accords, which we hope will create a space and transparent environment that facilitates exploration, science, and commercial activities for all of humanity, in NASA's words. But at the same time, we've begun to think more closely about the social and human aspects of exploration, commercialization, safety, and the possibility of settlement. Indeed, the question arises, how are we to conduct ourselves and behave towards the new environments that we encounter? How will our interaction with space, driven necessarily by a few, actually benefit the many? Well, all such questions force us to reflect upon the role of the social sciences, or to observe the role that they should play, hand in hand with the natural sciences and technologies that have rightly dominated the scene. Now, in this active reflection, I believe it's also time to fashion a new focus on Australia, and on Australia's special, present, and potential participation in the space enterprise. As historians like Kerry Doherty and others have recorded, Australia actually has a very long history of engagement with space. And since 2018, as we all know, we have our own space agency, which has many possibilities open to it. We hope will open new frontiers. Nationally, we have excellent media coverage and several centers devoted to space law and strategy and defense. But as social scientists and humanists, we're relatively new, relatively recent to this conversation. It seems to me we must ask even more fundamental questions, not only about the how, but also about the whether, the why, and in what ways and to what ends, and with what consequences do we do what we're doing. We must question in whose interest do we as Australians venture first to the moon, then to Mars and beyond. It is to these questions that the series has been devoted. 9 moderators and their teams have kindly accepted our invitation, draw upon their respective discourses of culture, history, health, heritage, law, defense, diplomacy, and dealing with the practicalities of being there as well as getting there. To conclude, we've asked 2 generations of young Australians, including recent graduates and some still at school, to join us and to reflect upon the prospect of their own spacefaring futures. We hope you'll enjoy this exercise and participate in our conversation through the chat facilities. As Chris has mentioned, all sessions will be recorded and made available for later viewing in classrooms or dinner table conversations such as we are having to have at home. Warm acknowledgements go to all the members of our teams and to the many who have helped us in these difficult times. At the moment, let me begin by thanking Chris Hatherley and the Academy of the Social Sciences and my colleagues in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Sydney. Also, our guides, Jose Torrealba and Jacob Craig, and most especially my colleague, Ms. Claire McFarlane, for getting us safely away. This morning, it's my particular pleasure to welcome as our moderator, Vice Admiral Paul Madison, Director of the University of New South Wales Defence Research Institute in Canberra, and a former High Commissioner of Canada to Australia. And now I'm pleased to see an Australian citizen as well. Welcome, Paul, to the chair and to our session on defending space. Over to you.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. And thank you, Professor McLeod, for the opportunity to be part of this panel, and congratulations to you and your team on what you've achieved so far with this very impressive webinar series. My interest in space began, I suppose, as a young officer in the Canadian Navy back in the the early 80s, where we would go to sea and we had tables which let us know when we would be vulnerable to Soviet satellite reconnaissance passage overhead, and we would deliberately switch off our air search, surface search, navigation, fire control systems in order to avoid detection by the Soviets. And that sort of moved forward, and I found myself a few years later at sea in the Arabian Gulf during the first Gulf War, and we had a team in the back of the operations room which was linked into the U.S. Global Space Surveillance System, and in the near real-time infrared detection via geosynchronous satellites of Saddam Hussein's short-range ballistic missile Scud launches in southern Iraq, and we would be alerted to the launch site, the azimuth, and the probable targeting location. Fast forward a few more years, and I found myself as one of only 2 Canadians to be posted into United States Space Command and appointed in command of a Space Control Center crew in Cheyenne Mountain, which was an extraordinary experience where we monitored the entire global space surveillance network, all activities in space, tracked the 8,000 then known man-made objects in Earth orbit. And of course, now that I think has ballooned up well past 20,000, 30,000 objects. Then back in the Gulf in command of a destroyer, where all of our operations in 2003 were dependent on space in terms of intelligence, queuing to targets in the Arabian Gulf. We would board vessels. We would interview their crews. We would do some biometric stuff, and we would real time via space assets determine whether or not we were dealing with a threat to the coalition. And then as commander of the Navy around 10 years ago, I was part of the stand-up of a space capability in Canada, which is similar to what Air Commodore Gordon is doing here in Australia. So enough about me. I'm just thrilled to be part of this panel. I got some extraordinary folks with us today. First of all, Air Commodore Phil Gordon. Phil is a Royal Australian Air Force officer, currently serving as the Director General Air Defence and Space. And as part of that role, Phil leads all programs involving integrated air and missile defense and space control. He's a fighter pilot, flown F-18s, was part of the planning and transition to the F-35, and obviously is very much involved in defense's planning and stand-up of a head of a space division or a space command. And we're interested in hearing a bit more from Phil about that. Also really thrilled to have with us Christine Zeitz. Christine is one of Australia's most prominent senior executives in the defense sector, an entire career devoted to defense and national security here in this country and overseas, currently serving as the general manager, Asia Pacific region at Northrop Grumman, where she's not only responsible for all of Northrop Grumman's activities here in Australia, but has oversight over activities in Japan and in South Korea. A rich background, Christine, with as chief executive of Lighthouse previously, having also worked with Lockheed Martin, and for many years with BAE Systems Australia. Wonderful to have you with us, Christine. And thirdly, Professor Russell Boyce, someone who I work with frequently because we share the same campus. Russell is the chair for Intelligent Space Systems and director of UNSW Cyberspace here in Canberra. Russell is one of these extraordinary scientists who, from whom I learn something new every time we speak. He's had a lot to do with hypersonics and scramjets in the past, and is focused now on deploying artificial intelligence-based capacity in orbit. And in fact, you can see, and he'll talk more about it, to one of his M2 satellites behind him in that picture. Russ was instrumental in the stand-up of the Australian Space Agency, and is one of a rare number of scientists to be appointed a fellow of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. So an extraordinary panel here this morning. And we'll just get right underway. I thought we would start with you, Phil, as the theme here is defending space. If you could provide for our audience a sense of where we are in Australia in the ADF in terms of space capability. What are the issues that you're dealing with on a daily basis? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? And where do you see us going?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Look, it's great to be here, and I'm pretty passionate about space, so I'm always happy to accept an invite to contribute to debates like this, because it really is an exciting time to be talking about space generally, but specifically defending space, because the Australian Defence Force is really going through a pivotal transformation at the moment, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get serious about space and do it well. So to your question then, if I start with where I think we are now, I kind of describe to people that we're a space consumer. And the analogy I use is that we are a platinum frequent flyer on the US space airline. So we can get from A to B very well. We've got club access, priority seating. Like, we know how to travel around and get things done in space. And that obviously relies on our strong partnership with the US. But arguably, the only sovereign space capability that Australia has is the M2 CubeSat that Russell launched earlier this year, and he'll talk about that. And that was a collaboration between the University of New South Wales and the Royal Australian Air Force. But everything else we have in space, every other effect we generate from space, is through our partnerships and through our industry contracts. So no surprises, our chief kind of partner in space is the US. And Paul, you've explained, some of the reasons why that's, the vast experience the US has. I've had the opportunity to be in Cheyenne Mountain as well. It's just remarkable what the US has accomplished with the space enterprise. And we've invested in a number of collaborations and efforts with the US through the years. So we've bought into the wideband global SATCOM constellation. So we've, if you like, got timeshare on a global SATCOM capability. In my own portfolio, we've rehosted the C-band radar, which actually in its early days supported the Apollo missions. It's been upgraded a little bit since then, but not a lot. And it's been rehosted out in Western Australia near Exmouth. And next year we'll have the Space Surveillance Telescope coming online, which is another really exciting US cutting edge capability. Through our industry contracts and affiliations, we've got things like the Optus contract, which has a military communications payload on an Optus satellite, and there's a number of other commercial arrangements. But really, we'd be hard pressed to point to anything that's orbiting the Earth that we own, other than Russell's CubeSat. As a result of this kind of space consumerism, we've kind of grown up in a very loose federation of kind of end users of the space products looking after their particular partnerships and arrangements. And we haven't had a kind of centralised approach to space in defence, but as I'll explain, that's about to change. I think the other key point to make in our thinking is that we've kind of taken space for granted. And I think a lot of people do, and I think a lot of people certainly out in the civilian sector just assume that space is going to be there and available for us to use, that their internet's going to work, and that their mobile phone reception's going to work, and their GPS navigation's going to work. And we've been guilty of that as well, and treated space as an assured, safe domain where we're just accessing services and we can always rely on it being there. But I think things are changing now on multiple fronts for defence, and not just our defence, but around the world. There is now growing acceptance that space is congested, contested, and competitive is the phrase you'll hear them use. taking that a step further, it means that we have seen demonstrations of people conducting hostile acts in space to deny space capabilities for other countries. So we can't just assume that whatever we've got up there will be available to us. The second big change, and really the tipping point for all of this, was the government's recent commitment to the development of a sovereign space capability and a sovereign space industry. And governments, pledged over $7 billion in the next decade for defence alone to really go after some sovereign capabilities and to help us on that journey from being a space consumer to a space operator and a space contributor. That's obviously a really exciting catalyst. It generates a lot of interest when there's money involved, and obviously it is part of a coordinated strategy that saw the creation of the Australian Space Agency to drive jobs and growth in the Australian space industry sector. And I'm sure Christine will have plenty more to say about that. The last of the three big changes I think we're undergoing at the moment, and you alluded to it in the opening remarks, is Defence is kind of reorganising and getting serious about space and elevating the leadership and the level of coordination. And we're looking at creating, or it's been announced that we're going to have a 2-star leading the space enterprise for Defence from the end of the year. So at the moment called a Space Division. We'll see what it ends up being called. It's still subject to ongoing work to define the roles, responsibilities and the resources of that. But it's really important to take this kind of loose federation of consumerism and actually start driving the bus to the future that we want. And so that's probably the most exciting part and the most exciting opportunity, because it's within our grasp to shape how that happens. As we do that, though, as we go through this transformation, there's multiple challenges as we go from, to use the same analogy, a frequent flyer on an airline to running our own airline. A very different proposition when you jump on an airline that's all arranged and fueled and the flight plan's in and you just fly from Canberra to Brisbane. It's a very different proposition to actually running an airline that allows that can get people from Canberra to Brisbane. So we've got a lot to learn, and there's a lot ahead of us. I'm actually not concerned about funding. I'm not concerned about industry, and I'm not concerned about technology. And Christine and Russell will no doubt reassure on the significant strengths that exist in Australia to help deliver the outcomes the government is seeking. The biggest challenge that we face in Defence really is a human one. And I'm not just saying that because this is a social sciences webinar. This is the real make or break for us. If we take a business as usual approach and we don't put our minds to this new domain and these opportunities, then we will miss the opportunity to do this right. How do we get the people with the skills, the knowledge and the authority, the mandate, if you like, to actually drive the way we implement these changes and these opportunities, so that we don't just, I guess, repeat maybe what we saw in World War I, when armies started flying aeroplanes and used them like, spotters and cavalry for artillery pieces. We saw a rapid evolution of the use of air power coming out of World War I, as air power evolved into its own domain with its own opportunities, strengths and weaknesses. And we want to try and accelerate that learning for space so that we don't treat it as a terrestrial effect. So, a lot of that in my space is around how do we set the correct requirements, how do we go after the right capabilities, how do we stitch it all together into an architecture of what Australia wants to be as a middle power in space. We can't just buy parts and pieces and expect it to work together in an integrated system. We've got to be smarter than that. The command and control. So again, when things are being run by other countries or contractors and they're not under threat, command and control is just a contract mechanism. But when you actually have to fight and defend your assets that are being interfered with or attacked, you need to actually have a very sophisticated approach to command and control. And it's not just space command and control, it's how does it fit in with joint command and control? Because it's a whole of a defence effort. And I think one of the most interesting things that I see that's happening at the moment, but we've still got a way to go, is this shift in mindset from this kind of safe, fluffy, notwithstanding space is hard, but safe and fluffy and uncontested environment to one where people are trying to actively interfere with our access to space to gain a competitive advantage in the times of a crisis or a conflict. How do we protect and defend our space access? And how do we deter others from taking hostile actions against our space assets? So this is a whole other sphere of military thinking, and I would venture social sciences. Cold War deterrence approaches have a lot of utility with space, but it's not the same. We need to think in a more sophisticated way about how do we impose costs and deny benefits to shape the thinking of a potential adversary, so that we don't have to, have our satellites destroyed. So, what does the future look like for defence? Look, I think it's really exciting. As I said, this is really the tipping point for us as we move forward. I'll say from the outset, I think we'll still be very reliant on our partnerships with the US and other allies, but increasingly other allies as well, because while Australia is going through this transformation, we're seeing a lot of other countries around the world doing the same. So obviously the US kind of stepped up the game with the creation of the US Space Force. But since that time, we've seen Australia announce we're going to stand up a two-star led Space Command or Space Division. The Royal Air Force has a two-star Space Command. Germany's creating a Space Command. The French Air Force has changed its name. It's no longer the French Air Force. It's the French Air and Space Force, and they have a two-star Space Command. So we're seeing across the globe this kind of awakening of our allies and partners on the criticality of space and the need to do it properly. And so we expect our international engagements, our partnerships and our collaborations to be a key part of our space enterprise as we move forward. But that said, as good as those partnerships are, we definitely aspire to a suite of sovereign capabilities, both here on the ground and in orbit, that we have control over, and we can independently verify, control, and assure our access to space. And those capabilities should be in the hands of a cadre of space professionals that have benefited from education such as what University of New South Wales is doing, and being informed by the work that Russell's doing in his CubeSat work. But we've got to get people who are prepared to think big and really chase the dream and drive this forward and grasp this opportunity. To do that, we need focused leadership with authorities and resources and a mandate to think big and to invest in the right areas. We have to have a sophisticated understanding of how we make decisions in an operational context in space. What is our space strategy? And we're certainly working at the moment on a space strategy for defence. I expect we'll see a very vibrant Australian space industry and academia, and I look forward to hearing Christine and Russell talk some more about that. But I really think we're at an exciting juncture of space in Australia. And in my last job, one of the curious things that I was in charge of was the Woomera prohibited area, that's where we were as one of the leading spacefaring nations back in the 1960s. To go out there and see the Eldo launch sites in a state of disarray at the moment. But Australia has a proud space history. We just kind of lost our way for a few decades, and I really look forward to us regaining our place amongst all of the exciting stuff that's going on in space. So thanks very much. I really look forward to the questions and the discussion at the end. Thanks.
Hey, thank you, Phil. Just a superb and impassioned overview of where you and your team are in defense around space capability development here in Australia. You mentioned defense industry a couple of times. You actually said you weren't concerned about defense industry. We all know that there's a very dynamic triangle of defense industry, ADF and defense and academia that works together to generate and accelerate capability development for the ADF and alongside our allies. And but I'd like to sort of segue now over to Christine. Then, Christine, you've been in this segment now for, I guess, 30 years here in Australia. You remember the times that Phil was referring to earlier in the programs, and you've seen it all evolve. You've seen the good stuff, the not so good stuff, and now you are leading here in Australia in partnering with defense to generate this kind of capability. Tell us what you think. Where are we? Where have we come from? And what are the opportunities for you going forward?
Oh, thanks, Paul. And it's a pleasure to be here. And Air Commodore Gordon gave such a great outline of the need, if you like, the strategic demand and where we're going. And that's so critically important. In fact, when he was speaking, things came to mind, and I've decided to kind of switch my comments a little to kind of flow perhaps a bit more from what Air Commodore Gordon was saying. He touched on the need and the demand and the focus now that the defence leadership are taking in this space with absolutely the appointment of, I think it's Kath Roberts into that position to run Space Command. We've seen the commitment of the government with the funding into the Australian Space Agency. So for industry, this is really, really important to have the leadership and the need very present and committed by government, because then industry can lean in and invest. When you say, what can you tell us from the past? I had my kind of first role in my 20s was following around my boss and talking to ministers, including Bronwyn Bishop, who, those that remember, Bronwyn Bishop had a 5-point industry plan. And I was a touch naive then, and I thought, well, she's the Minister for Defence Industry. She's got a 5-point industry plan. That must be true. And we had an industry policy. And very soon I learned that just because we had a 5-point industry plan and an industry policy, it didn't mean that there was actually that intent. And I can tell you that this change in the intent of having industry as a fundamental input to capability, which is the language we use in the, sorry for your listeners that aren't familiar with that, from a first principles review, probably about 6 years ago now, one of the observations was, defence can't do this by its own itself. You've got defence personnel, you have allies, and industry. And industry, to be seen as a fundamental input to that capability, changes the game of the relationship and the partnership with industry and defence. And when Air Commodore Gordon's talking about the challenge, the leadership challenge, we've got to look at this in a different way. I firmly believe, and you would expect that I'd say this, that industry leaders have a tremendous role to play in partnership with defence leaders and bringing in our allies who are experienced in this domain. And so as we all tackle the problem, we will be better for the solution. And I've certainly seen that switch. And so why is it switched from kind of words on a page to, I actually gave a speech to defence leadership. I don't know that you were there, Phil, in one of the, Tony Fraser and the secretary was there and the chief was there. And I read out Bronwyn Bishop's 5 points, and they actually thought I was reading Christopher Pine's 5 points because they're actually the same. So why is it different? And it's different now because the policies come behind. There's actually been policy change to enact the change and the commitment to make that happen. And we have seen, good discussions around sustainment of capability. We had the Valley of Death and the shipbuilding side. And, there really needed to be a commitment to industry around, what is the demand and where do we see these valleys? And there's a great conversation now. We're only embryonic and we're not there yet around export, filling those gaps with export. So all those wonderful lessons we've learned about industry being a partner, fundamental input, solving the problems and planning together, absolutely applies to the space industry. There's no reason why it's different. And so when we look at the space industry, what do we see? We see in defence, the defence players, and we see this wonderful SME chain spawning up with green shoots from the Australian Space Agency and the funding and the commitment from the Department of Industry. And those companies, Myriota, at universities, of course, like UNSW and other universities are doing R&D, and Gilmore Space and Fleet, and these companies that are deriving investment because venture capitalists need to invest in something. They certainly can't get an interest recovery in the bank. So, investing in this domain. So you have the makings of the primes, partnered with those countries that our nation is allied with. You have the SME chain and the R&D chain. So you do have the foundation here that I think is off to a very good start, having lived for 31 years with defence. We're starting at a more mature thought process, I think, of bringing industry in together with academia, with defence, on solving the problems. So what would I say is going to kind of make this challenging? And it's very similar to your comments, Air Commodore, around the thinking and the leadership. Because and you said in some point, we've got to set the requirements and we've got to set the notion of what we're going to do. And this is an area where we can become unstuck. We set requirements and we procure capability in such a rigid way that we actually encourage the responses from industry to solve a particular problem to be refined and kind of funneled in as an apples to apples comparison to serve a procurement process. So there's a challenge around how do you involve industry in the thinking and then conduct what must be done, a transparent, competitive, compliant procurement process, which Australia is renowned for in the world. We mustn't damage the way in which we acquire very large procurement activities from industry. We do it very well, but there is a dynamic of how you do that. And, Air Commodore Gordon is also responsible for an air and missile defence program, of which Defence has taken a very different engagement with industry for. And so I think that's another green shoot, is a recognition that, we need to have, and it's hard, right? It's difficult because it's a new model. So I think, the momentum and excitement you hear in Air Commodore Gordon, you'll hear from industry. The joy about space is that it's much more easy to translate, again, on the social side. People see rockets, they see, and I think they do understand to some sense that Google Maps is connected to something up there. But I think the way to attract, and probably Russell may touch on this, the way to attract people into this industry, perhaps is a little easier than the effort to convey the attractiveness of defence. And so I think there is something there that's quite exciting. And then you have, one of my comments was going to be that Emma, I'm getting Kath Gordon and Enrico Palmero will have to be very best friends, because, that civil to defence side is going to be very, very important. And we want to get that leverage across both to help with the dynamic that we see around demand in defence, either from civil or from export. So I think there's many, many lessons learned from the development of the defence industry. I think it's really positive that defence has such a need for this capability in the space sector, and that we have a very, beginning to have a vibrant civil space sector. So I can see a really nice marriage coming together and very positive. So I'll end it there because I want to leave some time. Thank you.
Yeah, that was superb, Christine. Thank you for laying that out. And I like the way you articulated the challenge around how do we accelerate capability development for the ADF at a speed that's relevant, especially in relation to the rate at which the threat is evolving in the Indo-Pacific region that has the potential to put real risk around Australia's national security interests. How do we accelerate that? How do we identify those impediments in programmatics, from defining the requirement to bringing industry, academia, international partners together in a new, innovative, dynamic ways that then get capability commercialized and deployed with the ADF warfighter sooner rather than later. Folks are looking at the US sort of DARPA model, putting more structure around innovation in between academia, industry, and government, and perhaps that's what we need to continue sort of leaning towards here in Australia. But that, I think, is another good segue over to Professor Russell Boyce. And Russ, you've been listening patiently here. So much that I know you can bring to this conversation. And both Christine and Phil have talked about the human capital part of all of this. I mean, you can't deploy capability without the folks who are there with the education, with the motivation, with the skills, and so you obviously are involved in that kind of thing at UNSW. But perhaps first, before you talk about people, could you give us a bit of a background on your M2 mission that the Air Commodore Gordon referred to in his remarks, and then sort of use that perhaps to describe your vision for attracting and sustaining human capital into the space segment here in Australia.
Thanks. Excuse me. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, those satellites you can see behind my head, they together are M2. There's actually two and not one, although right as we speak, they're in orbit above us, joined together at the hip, operated independently as two very, very complex satellites, but flying as one at the moment. Very soon, we're going to be splitting them from each other and flying them in formation. That's a very, very complex thing to do. It's one of the ingredients you need to develop constellations of low Earth orbit satellites that can work as one, that can share information, can communicate with each other, and create a global reaching capability for Earth observing, for communications, to meet the needs of defence and others. M2 is certainly the most sophisticated and complex satellite system that has ever been developed in Australia by Australians. And it's probably one of the most complex CubeSat missions that's ever been attempted anywhere in the world. One of the interesting things that we're doing with it is deploying artificial intelligence into orbit. We have processing capabilities and artificial intelligence algorithms on board M2. We've demonstrated them already, and we'll be ramping them up and up and up in the coming months and couple of years to push the state of the art for intelligent space systems. So perhaps enough about that for the moment. I wanted to touch on three lenses into how you attract and educate and nurture the future skilled workforce that's needed for defence space. The first lens, the workforce of the future in general, doesn't matter about whether it's space or not, is going to require greater and greater skill sets in areas of technology, particularly around automation and artificial intelligence, in the area of social and emotional skills, particularly around leadership and teamwork in very complex situations. Space and operating in space and deriving benefit from it and applying it to solve challenges and opportunities on the ground is a very, very complex challenge. The workforce also requires higher cognitive skills. This includes critical thinking and the ability to process complex information. These are the skills required very much for the future space workforce. Space inspires kids. In fact, it's been said many times that the two things that inspires young people or children most are space and dinosaurs. Certainly space inspires, and it's a fantastic thing for pointing young people towards STEM careers, but it offers so much more than that. If you think about the complexities of space, everything that needs to come together to create a space system, everything that needs to come together to operate it, to extract benefit, as I was alluding to before, those complexities and the cross-disciplinary skills required, the relevance to all aspects of society, they're actually the perfect combination to inspire not just the technologists, but the critical thinkers and the leaders of the future. So if you think some more about that, there is an intersection between the future workforce attributes, between the current needs and opportunities for the current and the future space sector, the unique ability of space to inspire STEM, critical thinking and leadership skills, and also at the moment, the accelerating pace that we have in our country and globally in both space and in disruptive technology areas such as artificial intelligence. This represents an immediate and compelling opportunity for Australia at large. So, quick example, at UNSW Canberra Space, we've identified this and we've been developing a concept for a national, in fact, a trans-Tasman and potentially global space innovation challenge to seize this opportunity, where we would recognise that the young people of today in high schools and in universities are very capable of engaging in space activities and very capable of engaging in the data analytics, the data science that is needed to combine with those space activities. And in a competitive environment, we would be able to educate and inspire and attract those people into the programs at universities that are needed to turn out that future workforce. So that's one of the lenses I wanted to take a quick look at. The other two, space education through immersion. UNSW Canberra Space is an example of this. We started back in about 2015, and since then we've developed and flown 5 satellites with M2, the 2 M2 satellites being the most recent of those, all of them for defence. We've created a very special space research and education environment at the Australian Defence Force Academy in Canberra. We've also created a professional space engineering team that has the largest concentration of space mission development experience in Australia. Along the way, we have learnt the hard way that space is hard. Our second mission, M1, we got it to orbit and we never heard from it again. That was a growth experience for us, and in turn a growth experience for much of the approach to developing space missions in Australia. We took a deep dive on the way we go about things in our team, the processes and even the culture. And we learned from that, and since then we've flown 2 more and they have been successful, and things are up and up and up, and we're really pushing the boundaries. So we've had this experience along the way. We've been contributing significantly to the Australian defence space industry. There's a supply chain of about 30 organisations in Australia that feed into our missions, and we've actually created 3 spin-off companies. So we have a vision moving forward to expand on all of that, to build an undergraduate space cohort from various disciplines, including humanities and social sciences, to come together in a complex multidisciplinary environment and complex thinking processes, and to be able to understand user requirements and to develop, build and operate student satellite missions to meet those real user requirements, and to perform real space domain awareness activities in support of those missions. By doing that, you achieve the following. It's not until you really, truly experience the harsh reality of the challenges of space and operating in space that you understand and are able to step along the path towards expertise. And our hope and vision is that we will be able to make a significant and enduring contribution to Australia in that process. Lastly, and the third lens, our professional engineering team is Australia's best breeding ground for skilled professionals for space. We're very, very proud that so far 20 of our team have gained experience and skills with us in doing the hard things, and they've now moved on into the Australian high-tech sector, particularly to the benefit of the defence space industry. And we look forward to more and more of that. So let me summarise with one quick point. If you do it properly and if you do it professionally in a university environment, not in an academic ivory tower sense, and not just playing, not just mucking around, but truly professionally, university-based space mission activity that immerses students and graduates in the realities and complexities of real innovative space missions is an excellent way, in my opinion, and I think we've proven that, to generate an immediately employable, skilled space workforce. Done.
Hey, thanks, Russ. And congratulations to you and your team on what you continue to do in terms of space engineering, mission design, and getting capability for Australia up in orbit. Look, we're getting near the end of our time here. For those of you who in the audience who would like to ask questions, there's a Q&A button there. Just get your questions in. I'll have a look as you post them. But just having listened to the three of you, so defense industry, academia, I'd like to go back to something that Air Commodore Gordon said right at the beginning. And it sort of ties in with the themes in this seminar or series. You know, a number of presenters at other seminars here have talked about the issues related to lunar basing, off-Earth mining, the Mars mission, the use of space for such extraordinary services to the planet and to mankind. And yet, I think there's some concern in the community when someone like Air Commodore Gordon describes the increasing contestation of space as a military operating domain. Most social scientists, I would think, would prefer to see space as a free and open commons to be used for the betterment of mankind. And so with that sort of fundamental tension there, I'm wondering whether, Phil, you can talk to this contest, this competitive nature now of space, and what that might mean in as we move forward in this century.
Yeah, Paul, you're not the first one to ask this question, and I'm sure you in your former roles have been asked this question a number of times as well. So the reality is, while most of the world has treated safe space as something that just is there to be used, competition in space has been around since the earliest days of Sputnik, and the US and other superpowers have been playing the traditional move counter move game in space for a long time now. We've had anti-satellite tests launches that have included destructive tests, creating thousands of pieces of debris, etc. So my usual answer to this question is, if everyone would agree and hold to the fact that we'd all just play nice in space, that would be great. But you can't put that genie back in the bottle. People are already competing in space. There are already military technologies applied to the space domain. And so I think the real game is making sure that we can moderate people's behaviours, we can shift their decision calculus through deterrence, through good collaboration and communication, such that people don't do things that make it worse for everyone. It's pretty hard to justify creating a cloud of thousands of pieces of debris that jeopardise other space infrastructure that impacts all of us. And obviously, the movie Gravity being the textbook example of what happens if too many things crash into each other. So I think all of the militaries around the world involved in space are very cognizant of the need to preserve space as a commons for all of us to use for scientific and exploration and all of the things that enrich our life. But the reality of great power competition is that we need to be a bit grown up about the threats that exist and the need to apply all elements of national power in a very sophisticated way to make sure people don't make poor decisions that ruin space for all of us. I might leave it there and let others jump in.
I'm just going to move on to the next question because we're getting close to time, and I have a question from James Derderian from the University of Sydney, who starts by saying he's just read Berger's Liftoff, which I haven't read, so I assume that this is a book that others would be familiar with. And he's wondering if Australia could ever generate or support its own Elon Musk or SpaceX type enterprise, given the important early support to that work by DARPA and our ongoing relationship to the US Department of Defense. So that's an industry question, Christine. I might toss that one over to you.
I was thinking about who could pay for it. I think Andrew Forrest might be a contender. I think we need to get ourselves a sponsor to put some serious money into something like that, to have it kick off here in Australia. You know, that's a dimension I didn't speak about, but there's no doubt that with the collaboration with the US, with the small shoots we have in Australia, there's a formation there. But something like the SpaceX and the Elon Musk, I think we need quite a player here in Australia to take that mantle.
Thanks, Christine. Well, look, folks, I'm always amazed by how quickly time flies when we do these sorts of webinars. And it's because of how fascinating and interesting is the context and perspective that is shared by folks like Air Commodore Gordon, Christine Zeitz, and Professor Russell Boyce. So thank you all for joining me here for this today. And I'm going to turn back over to Professor Roy McLeod now for his wrap-up.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you all for being so helpful and constructive. We will continue to be in touch. This won't be the last word. We'll speak to each other on this subject. And so much of what you said touches so much to my own goals and objectives in academia. And I think we really must think together. I was just thinking, of course, I would naturally say, wouldn't I, as a historian of science, one of my best students, a historian, an ancient historian, in fact, is now a senior person in AGO, in satellite intelligence. Historians can do anything, so it's not just the stem cells that we have to encourage to be involved in space. I want to just, in thanking you, looking forward to the next session, which I think ties in quite nicely. It's to do with space diplomacy, law, and regulation. And the theme really is to consider the diplomatic, legal, and regulatory parameters within which Australia conducts space activities, and to look at the way in which Australia will come to look to confront the issues that define its relationship to space and with other spacefaring nations in the years to come. So please, if you have a moment at 2 o'clock this afternoon, between 2 and 3, where that conversation will take place. And if you possibly can, look back to some of the earlier sessions which have been recorded, which I think you'll find fascinating, that I have, going from Aboriginal views of the cosmos right through to notions of how we might deal with each other. Thank you once again. Thank you, Paul. Let's be in touch. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.